The neon sign above the diner flickered weakly, its light casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Inside, the hum of an old jukebox filled the quiet room as Ethan sat at the corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee. It was the cheapest thing on the menu, and all he could afford. He stared out the fogged-up window, his reflection overlapping with the faint glow of streetlights outside. Life hasn't been kind to Ethan lately. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd lost his job at the local factory, a place he'd worked at for almost a decade. With no savings to fall back on and rent long overdue, his days were consumed with job applications, rejection emails, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Tonight, he'd come here to escape the suffocating silence of his empty apartment and to stretch his last $10 bill into one more night of hope. The bell above the diner's door jingled, breaking Ethan's train of thought. A man stumbled inside, his clothes disheveled, his face weathered and tired. The stranger clutched a battered briefcase and looked around uncertainly before approaching the counter. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hoarse. "Could I get a coffee? I don't have any money, but I'll pay you back." The cashier, a teenage boy scrolling on his phone, barely glanced up. "Sorry, no freebies," he muttered, tapping at the screen. The man looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He hesitated for a moment before turning to leave, but Ethan spoke up before he could take a step. "Wait!" Ethan called out, digging into his pocket. He pulled out his last crumpled $10 bill and placed it on the counter. "Get him the coffee, and whatever's left, let him grab a snack." The stranger turned, his eyes wide with surprise. I can't accept that," he stammered, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Don't worry about it," Ethan said with a shrug, trying to mask the desperation that came with knowing he had just given away everything he had left. "I've been where you are. Just pay it forward when you can." The man stared at Ethan for a moment, something unreadable in his gaze before finally nodding. "Thank you," he said quietly, taking a seat at a nearby table. Ethan left the diner a few minutes later, his stomach growling and his wallet empty. As he walked home under the cold night sky, he didn't see the stranger pull out a notepad and write something down. Nor did he notice the faint glint of a gold watch peeking out from the man's sleeve. It would be weeks before Ethan understood just how much that moment of kindness would change his life. Ethan trudged home through the quiet streets, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his threadbare jacket. The wind bit at his cheeks, and the empty ache in his stomach reminded him of what he'd just given up. But despite the nagging worries about his own situation, there was a flicker of warmth in his chest. "At least I helped someone tonight," he thought. "Maybe that'll count for something." The following weeks weren't any easier. Ethan's landlord had run out of patience, leaving a bright red eviction notice taped to his door. He sold off his television and pawned an old watch his father had given him just to scrape together enough for groceries. Day after day, he pounded the pavement, handing out resumes and sitting through interviews that always seemed to end with the same polite rejection. "We'll be in touch." One afternoon, as he walked back from another fruitless job interview, Ethan's car broke down. The old sedan sputtered, then stalled in the middle of an intersection. Drivers behind him honked angrily as he pushed the vehicle to the side of the road, sweat trickling down his back despite the winter chill. "I can't catch a break," he muttered, leaning against the hood and staring at the engine in frustration. With no money for repairs, Ethan left the car parked on the street, figuring he'd have to sell it for parts. A week later, Ethan found himself downtown, walking past towering glass office buildings he could only dream of working in. He clutched a folder of resumes, his feet aching from hours of walking. As he passed an upscale cafe, something or someone caught his eye. Sitting at an outdoor table was the stranger from the diner. But this man looked completely different. Gone were the disheveled clothes and the air of desperation. Instead, he wore a tailored suit, and a sleek black car was parked at the curb. He was sipping an espresso, speaking animatedly with another well-dressed man. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. "Is that him?" he whispered to himself, stepping closer to get a better look. It was the same man. There was no doubt. But how could this be the same person who'd needed $10 for coffee just weeks ago? The stranger glanced up and made brief eye contact with Ethan. For a moment, his expression shifted as though he recognized him. But then he turned back to his conversation, leaving Ethan standing there, stunned and confused. Ethan's initial confusion turned to anger as he walked away. What kind of game was he playing? He muttered under his breath. Had the whole thing been a scam? Had he been duped by someone pretending to be down on their luck? The thought stung more than he cared to admit. He had so little to give, and he'd given it away to someone who clearly didn't need it. Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the man in the suit. He tried to focus on his job search, but the encounter gnawed at him. He replayed the night at the diner in his mind, questioning everything. Why did he need my $10 if he could afford a car like that? One chilly morning, Ethan checked his mail and found a letter addressed to him. The envelope was thick and embossed with a gold seal. Frowning, he tore it open and pulled out an elegant card. It was an invitation to a private event at a luxury hotel downtown. The name on the invitation made him pause. Robert Callahan. The name sounded familiar, but Ethan couldn't place it. Beneath it was a handwritten note. Ethan, your kindness didn't go unnoticed. Please join me for an evening of gratitude. R.C. Ethan hesitated. The fancy invitation felt so out of place in his life. He didn't own a suit or even shoes that weren't scuffed, but curiosity won out. If this was the stranger from the diner, he wanted answers. That evening, Ethan borrowed a blazer from his neighbor and made his way to the hotel. The grand ballroom was filled with people dressed in elegant gowns and sharp tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden light over the crowd. Ethan felt completely out of place as he navigated through the sea of wealth and luxury. At the center of the room stood the man from the diner, but tonight he was fully in his element. A microphone in hand, he addressed the crowd with ease and confidence. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice warm and commanding. Many of you know me as Robert Callahan, founder of Callahan Enterprises. But tonight, I want to share a story about a man who reminded me of the kind of person I strive to be. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. Callahan Enterprises. Now the name clicked. Robert Callahan was a billionaire tech entrepreneur known for his innovative companies and quiet philanthropy. Callahan continued, a few weeks ago, while conducting a social experiment, I found myself in a diner dressed as an ordinary man in need. I wanted to see if, in a world so often driven by greed, kindness still existed. That night, someone gave me his last $10, not knowing who I was or what I could offer in return. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as Callahan turned to face him directly. Ethan, he said, gesturing for him to come forward. Would you join me up here? The room erupted in murmurs as all eyes turned to Ethan. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to step forward. Callahan clasped his hand warmly and said, This is the man who reminded me that compassion doesn't need wealth, it only needs a heart. Ethan stood on stage, overwhelmed by the spotlight. Callahan smiled at him and addressed the crowd. Ethan didn't know it, but that $10 wasn't for me. It was for him. His act of generosity showed me that people like him deserve support. That's why tonight, I'm honored to announce that I'm covering all of Ethan's debts, offering him a position at one of my companies, and making a donation in his name to a local charity. The crowd erupted into applause, but Ethan barely heard it. His mind was spinning. He looked at Callahan, trying to process what was happening. I don't know what to say, he stammered. You don't have to say anything, Callahan said with a smile. Just keep being the kind of person who inspires others. After the formalities, Ethan and Callahan sat together at a quieter table. Ethan finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why me? Why did you choose to do this? Callahan leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Because you didn't hesitate. You didn't ask what was in it for you. You saw someone in need, and you acted. That kind of instinct is rare, Ethan. It reminded me of a time when I had nothing and someone helped me. I wanted to pay it forward, and you gave me the chance. Ethan nodded, still grappling with the surreal turn his life had taken. I wasn't expecting anything in return, he admitted. I've been in bad spots before. I know what it feels like. And that, Callahan said, is what makes you remarkable. Ethan left the gala that night feeling like he was in a dream. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for months, the unpaid bills, the eviction notice, the hopeless job hunt, suddenly felt lifted. It wasn't just about the money or the job offer, it was the validation, the sense that his small act of kindness had meant something far greater than he could have imagined. The following week, true to his word, Robert Callahan's team reached out to Ethan. A financial advisor helped settle his debts, and arrangements were made to repair his car. But what amazed Ethan the most was the job offer, a role in Callahan Enterprises' Community Outreach Division. "You've got a unique perspective," Robert had explained during their follow-up meeting. "You understand what it means to struggle, and that makes you perfect for helping us design programs to give others the opportunities they need." Ethan, still stunned by everything, had agreed. The first few weeks at Callahan Enterprises were overwhelming for Ethan. He had gone from scraping by to working in a high-rise office, surrounded by people in suits who seemed worlds apart from the man he'd been just a month ago. But Ethan threw himself into the work. His role was simple yet impactful, helping allocate funds and resources to charitable organizations, from food banks to homeless shelters. Ethan found himself thriving in his new role. His experiences made him uniquely empathetic to the struggles of those the company aimed to help. He knew how to speak to people in need, to listen to their stories, and to identify the areas where aid could make the biggest difference. Slowly but surely, he began to feel like he belonged. But despite his new success, Ethan never let go of the humility that had defined him. Every morning, he carried a simple reminder in his wallet, a copy of the receipt from the diner where he'd spent his last $10. It was his way of remembering where he'd come from and the power of small, selfless acts. Ethan's work with Callahan Enterprises soon began making waves. One day, Robert called Ethan into his office. The billionaire, still as unassuming and approachable as ever, had a glint of excitement in his eye. "I've been hearing good things about you," Robert said, gesturing for Ethan to sit. "The team tells me you've been going above and beyond with our outreach programs. I want to show you something." He handed Ethan a folder containing letters from people who had benefited from the company's new initiatives. A single mother wrote about how a scholarship program had allowed her daughter to attend college. A formerly homeless man described how a job training course funded by Callahan Enterprises had helped him get back on his feet. Ethan's eyes welled with tears as he read the stories. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this," he admitted. "It feels surreal." "That's the thing about kindness," Robert said. "It creates ripples. You gave me $10 and look where it led. Not just for you, but for so many others." Months later, Ethan was settling into his new life when Robert approached him with an idea. "There's an event coming up," Robert said, leaning against Ethan's desk. "A panel discussion on philanthropy. I want you to speak." Ethan blinked, startled. "Me? I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. I mean, I've only been doing this for a few months." "That's exactly why you're the right person," Robert said with a grin. "You're living proof that a single act of kindness can create a chain reaction. People need to hear your story, Ethan." Though nervous, Ethan agreed. The event was held in a grand auditorium filled with influential figures from the nonprofit and corporate worlds. As Ethan stepped onto the stage, he felt a wave of anxiety, but he remembered Robert's words. "Just tell your story." Ethan began, his voice steady but humble. "A few months ago, I was at my lowest point. I'd lost my job, my savings were gone, and I didn't know how I was going to make it through the week. But one night, in a diner, I saw someone who looked like he needed help more than I did. I gave him my last $10. It wasn't much, but it was all I had." He paused, scanning the audience. "What I didn't know was that the man I helped was Robert Callahan. And what I've learned since then is that even the smallest acts of kindness can have ripple effects far beyond what we can imagine. That $10 didn't just change my life, it's changing the lives of countless others." The room erupted into applause. Ethan looked out at the crowd, feeling a sense of purpose he had never known before. As Ethan's role at Callahan Enterprises grew, he began brainstorming ways to give back even more. Inspired by his own struggles, he proposed a program that offered microgrants to individuals facing temporary financial hardship, people who just needed a small boost to get back on their feet. The program, aptly named the Ripple Fund, quickly gained traction. One day, Ethan visited a local community center to meet some of the grant recipients. Among them was a young woman named Maria, a single mother who had used her grant to cover childcare while attending job training. Her story reminded Ethan of his own journey, and as they spoke, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "People like you are the reason I do this," he told her. "It's not just about the money, it's about showing people that someone cares." Ethan's transformation didn't go unnoticed in his old neighborhood. One afternoon, he visited the diner where it had all started. The same cashier was working behind the counter, though he seemed more attentive now, nodding politely as Ethan ordered a coffee. As he sipped his drink, Ethan noticed a young man sitting at a nearby table, counting change to pay for a modest meal. The sight brought back memories of his own struggles. Without hesitation, Ethan approached the man and quietly handed the waitress a $20 bill to cover the young man's meal. "Pay it forward," he said with a smile, echoing the words he had spoken months earlier. The young man looked up, startled, but before he could say anything, Ethan slipped out of the diner, his heart full. One evening, Ethan sat with Robert in his office, discussing future plans for the company's philanthropic efforts. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. "You know," Robert said, "I don't think either of us could have predicted how much that $10 would grow." Ethan chuckled, nodding. "It's funny. Back then, I thought I was losing everything. But that moment in the diner, it gave me more than I ever could have imagined." Robert raised a glass of sparkling water and a toast. "To Ripples," he said. Ethan clinked his glass against Robert's, smiling as he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a single act of kindness, an entire wave of change had been set in motion. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt certain that his best days were still ahead.